Neo-Idealism, Future Grand Strategy for Liberal Democracies. I'm Benjamin Tallis, Senior Research Fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations and Associate Europeum think tank here in Prague. And honestly, I'm not going to lie to you, this is a hell of a thrill. It is wonderful to see so many interesting. So good, as he said it twice. Yeah. I don't know what to do with that slight technical malfunction. We'll see what happens. Thanks, Martin. Yes, so it is a delight to be here today with so many people who have already given their intellectual energy and their time to developing what I think is the best chance for the future of liberal democracies. There is a new idealism at work in international politics. It's been pioneered by people and politicians in Ukraine, in the Czech Republic, where we sit today, and in the Baltic states. It's apparent in the actions and words of leaders around the free world. It's opened the door to a better kind of geopolitics for liberal democracies. It's reminded us of who we can be at our best and why we will need to be at our best, but thrive. Emerging from the response to Russia's assault on Ukraine, neo-idealism is a morally based approach to geopolitics, grounded in the power of values conceived as ideals to strive for, human rights and fundamental freedoms, social and cultural liberalism, democratic governance, self-determination for democratic societies, and the right of citizens in those societies to a hopeful future. Its pioneers treat these values as interests in themselves, and vigorously asserting that democracies need to collectively defend ourselves and double down on our liberal values in order to stand up to authoritarian regimes. The neo-idealists have shown how free societies can triumph in the emerging systemic competition. But for this to happen, neo-idealism needs to broaden its scope and its appeal. It needs to develop into a genuine grand strategy that can provide the guide, the lodestar, through which we can marshal the resources at our disposal, define the means that we need to achieve our ends. And to do that, we will need to master the multiple mega transitions that we face, not only geopolitical, but geoeconomic, not only ecological. And that's in bringing this event to fruition, and to the Stiftung Mercator for their financial support. Also to our partners at Europeum here in Prague for their support to this, and to the European Union for co-funding the event, and for the friendly and effective cooperation that we've had with them to bring this about. Thanks to Alexandra Vishnarova and Martin Vokalek for that. Special thanks also due to my team, to Yannick Hartmann and Julian Stöckler, pulling out all the stops to pull this event off over 2 countries. And to my fellow host of our podcast, Aaron Gash-Burnett, who you'll be hearing more from in a moment. And also to Forum 2000 for giving us this chance to have a pre-event for their main annual conference, and for the help they have given to make it happen. So thank you to Jakob Kleppert and his team. But special thanks are also due to Thomas Hendrik Ilves, sitting to my left, the former president of Estonia, who served in that role, but also in so many others, in the service of his country, but for the cause of liberal democracy more widely, and whose idea this event today actually was. Thomas, you're an inspiration, and I'm so grateful that you've pushed us to take this next step in developing neo-idealism into the grand strategy we need to thrive as well as survive. So Thomas, with that, over to you, and ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Thomas Hendrik Ilves to give our opening words today.
Well, thank you. I'm going to kind of give an overview of how we got here, and the task will be where to go. Like all neos, neoliberalism, neoconservatism, and why not neo-Stalinism and neo-Nazism, neo-idealism, of course, implies that there is something that once was and now is being revived. Is idealism something that needs to be revived? But then what is realism? Idealism is in itself, as an idea, made a brief appearance in the modern era in 1795 in Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace, in which he argued peace can be only achieved within a federation of republics, which these days we would take to be democracies. In the late 20th century idea that democracies don't need each other. Then idealism went into a 120-year-long slumber as various empires in Europe duked it out and maintained an anti-liberal order until Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which brought into the discussion the notion of the self-determination of nations, a profoundly democratic idea, a new concept that Wilson thought would apply only to Poland, and then much to his it taken up by everyone from Finland down through Eastern and Central Europe to the Balkans and beyond to the Middle East. It is important to keep in mind that this was above all an anti-imperial idea encompassing or directed at the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires. And then we went back into a slumber until we reached World War II, in which basically the US, it was the US, that imposed a muscular and pragmatic, and from the period beginning with 1944, an amazing range of solutions, beginning with the Bretton Woods Institution, the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT, UN, UNRWA, which were to deal with refugees, the UN, later on the Berlin Airlift, the Marshall Plan, the creation of NATO, and largely at US sort of nudging the European coal and steel community, for Europe and Radio Liberty, and pushing Germany to join NATO in 1956 against the objections of all kinds of other countries. Grounded in the idea that something had to be done in the liberal democratic order, no one other than the United States in the first post-war decade was in a position to do it. They had the money, and they had the will, and they had the arms. The corollary to this idea, however, was that once Europe was strong enough to stand on its own, which due to the Wirtschaftswunder and the boom boom years in Italy and similarly in France, which it was able to stand on its own at the founding of the EEC in 1956. And the idea, I guess the wish, was that the EEC would then also shoulder the burden, and it was no longer merely the United States that stood to defend liberal democracy. Europe, unfortunately, and in its narcissism and self-absorption, focused only on itself as a peace project, and broadcast Europe as a peace project for itself, not for anyone else, for the ensuing 65 years. The idea that others had was that the West was moral and would stand up for liberal democracies, which it didn't do. Really. The corollary to that was that as soon as authoritarian countries in Europe adopted and embraced liberal democracy, the European project would adopt and embrace them, which in fact EU or the EEC at the time did in the case of Greece, Spain, and Portugal when they overthrew their regimes. For Central and Eastern Europe, it was different. And we could see that the approach was already, on the part of the West, was already somehow that they're different. I mean, we can see that the failure of the West since, well, I would say the first event was the failure to support the uprising in East Berlin in 1953, followed by the Hungarian Revolution, which basically Hungarians led to believe that they were part of Europe and would be supported by Europe, found that, well, for realpolitik reasons, they were not. Bringing Central and Eastern Europe in the post-1989 period was grudging, and I would say from the beginning. Visegrad was given a slightly easier ride, but Germany, as we have seen in the Kohl memos released last year, was even opposed to independence for three victims of, nota bene, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Later, Kohl and Schröder did everything possible to keep these countries from joining the EU and NATO, and even after joining NATO, blocked the most essential element of NATO membership, defense planning, to the Baltic states. Instead, what we see more broadly is that Central and Eastern Europe became the Zwischenländer, the troublesome countries in between, that stood between Western Europe and El Dorado, the billions, if not trillions, that stood to be made in the corrupt, everything's for sale, Baltakistan, that is Russia to this day. And if you know the word Baltak, then you know what that means. Wandel durch Handel, or change through trade, didn't really affect much outwardly until the new millennium, when Russia began to assert itself again. How would the West go? Defend liberal democracy or go for making money? Well, Georgia 2008, followed by the American, where Obama blocked weapons. Germany did Nord Stream 2, and Rheinmetall built a center in Russia. Right. And then we have, so you don't get left out, we had the response of 10 Downing Street to MH17, which was a internal memo that was unfortunately photographed by a paparazzo as some minister was leaving 10 Downing Street, that said, roundly condemn the shooting down of a civilian airline, point B, do nothing that would affect possible Russian investment in the United Kingdom. Now, the problem was that Central and Eastern Europe, because of its long history of occupation as a colony of an imperial authoritarian Russia, whatever its name happened to be at the time, believed in the promises of the United States, the EU, and the message of liberty carried by Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Central and Eastern Europe was the part of the West that actually believed in the primacy of liberal values, and more importantly, that these must be defended, and defended with muscle and money, and did so in the uprisings of 1989 to 91. But the problem was, once that was accomplished, Central and Eastern Europe was simply not believed. Instead, it was dismissed by Western Europe as paranoid, as over the top. And so after 30 years of dismissing Central and Eastern European concerns and warnings, Western Europe grudgingly admitted that Russia is not a peace-loving kumbaya la-la land or a promising El Dorado for its business community. It took a while to reach that understanding. In fact, well, in the case of Germany and France, not until after 24 February 2022. And maybe not even then. Recall that half a year after we all found out about the horrors of Bucha, Emmanuel Macron was still calling East Europeans war. September a year ago. I will not speak of the 90s, which are even too disgusting to recall, when the common attitude towards Central and Eastern Europe was summed up in the expression heute gestohlen, morgen in Polen, or stolen today, tomorrow in Poland. The idea that you base your theories and actions on observable facts was abandoned by Western Europe in favor of a highly profitable illusion that these facts don't matter, and that with the people mentioning the facts anyway had problems and were probably exaggerating, and in general, let's not pay attention because we can make a lot of money. This is what has changed, in part because it turned out that we in Central and Eastern Europe were right, in part because, frankly, Ukrainians were dying for the sins and delusions of a West that ignored all empirical evidence that contradicted its naivete. The task before us is how to move from being right to doing something about it. The US was right in 1945 to 56 and did something, but then after that, stopped doing anything or more. Can Central and Eastern Europe, with the clout of the US, do something to defend the values and overcome the pull of corruption and money? So, the task before us. To paraphrase the document all of us in this part of the world, at least over a certain age, still know, Central and Eastern Europe have correctly interpreted the world. The point is to change it. That is the task of a new idealism.
Thank you very much. Please join me. As you see, the lightning comes before the thunder with New Idealism. We had Thomas quoting Marx. That was something I didn't have on my playbook for today, I have to say. Just to give a brief note on the running order of today, this opening session, these introductory remarks, and now the panel that will follow it are on the record and are live streamed, just so everyone's clear. So can I please ask our panelists for the first panel to come and assemble around this part of the table? We will move ourselves in order to accommodate that and to accommodate the live streaming. So please, Caroline Greuter, Chris Alexander, Alexander Vintman, Thomas Illich, you can stay where you are, Artis Fabrics, and Roderick Marks. Please come and arrange yourself around this horseshoe here. You will find a participants list and a list of our guiding questions for today in the documents that have been handed out, as well as information on the panels that are taking place. So do make sure you have a look at those documents that have been provided.
Just to be clear, you want us to reposition our seats so we're in frame of the...
Yes, exactly. Can you come down to this end of the table? Thank you, Alex, for helping clarify. We will make it better. We will make it better. So, please, Caroline, come into the center next to Thomas.
Okay.
Chris will get the chair. Right. Is it okay if we're on this side? It is, yeah. If you want to move it around a little bit so you're in front of that. Very much appreciate it. For that.
I thought I just used bags.
It was fantastic. And that's fine. Your tuning things. They all look the same.
All right, everyone. Welcome again to this event. Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much, Thomas, for that speech. And I really appreciate the last little bit, the very last thing you said. Central and Eastern Europe correctly interpreted the world, and now our task is to change it, which is ultimately the subject that we're getting to today. But before we get into that, first of all, my name is Aaron Gash-Burnett. I'm a journalist based in Berlin, and I co-host Berlin Side Out with Ben. Many of you have already been on the podcast, and some of you will be soon, so thank you very much for that. To start out with today, our main question for this particular panel is, who are the Neo-Idealists? And the reason why we ask that question is because Neo-Idealism is not simply a new school of thought or a new theory for us to analyze or to research and publish about. There are actual practitioners of Neo-Idealism right now who are who we can certainly see President Zelensky being the original standard bearer of Neo-Idealism, and to exhort liberal democracies to, in fact, put money and weapons where their mouth is and really stand behind their values. The famous phrase, "I need ammunition, not a ride." So I think that's, a big part of what kicked us all off. And since then, we've had a lot of other examples. Certainly the Baltics, but also in Finland, for example, and even to a certain extent in the EU Commission with Ursula von der Leyen's declaration. Ukraine is a member of them in. So with that all said, getting into the examples that we can draw and what that can teach us about Neo-Idealism and how to actually put in practice, we have a wonderful panel here. Obviously, Tom's needs no introduction. We already have Caroline de Greuter. She is a Europe correspondent based in Brussels and has written widely about Europe and its future in publications all over Europe. We have Chris Alexander here. often introduce Chris as my fellow Canadian. That's become a tradition, and I won't stop doing that now. I will just continue it. He is the former Minister of Immigration and Citizenship in Canada, and before that had a storied diplomatic career, including Canadian ambassador to Afghanistan. We have Alexander Vindman, the former Director of European Affairs for the United States National Security Council, and author of a best-selling book called Here Right Now. And we have Artis Pabriks. Where's Artis? There we go. Former Foreign and Defense Minister of Latvia, and actually, so you said last year a quote that I think sums up exactly what we're talking about today as well in Germany, which is, we are willing to die for freedom, are you? So this existential question that also lies at the heart of Neo-Idealism, which is a part of what we're talking about today. Finally, we have Robert Parks, Research Director at the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin and co-partner at this event. So welcome to everybody. Thank you very much. And let's start with that question of, are the Neo-Idealists, and where can we derive inspiration in what's actually happening in practitioners right now? Let's begin with
Caroline first.
Yes,
With me?
ladies first.
Please use the microphone.
Okay, we have to turn it on and off. Yeah. So yeah. Thanks very much for doing this, for organizing this. I think you're onto something. That's for sure. What exactly we're going to try to find out in the course of today. I, for one, I'm not sure. When I see. So I've been writing about European issues since 1999 from Brussels and other corners of Europe. And what I clearly see now is that politicians like Kaja Kallas, Mr. Rinkevičius, see, Landsbergis are something new. And maybe even von der Leyen could be called a neo-idealist. I think it's good news, because for I think with the war in Ukraine, several, not all, several Central and Eastern European countries are making finally their real entree in the European Union. For a long time, yes, they've been looked down on. They've been called, as Kaja Kallas has said several times, new countries for 20 years. Well, I don't think they're called new countries anymore for politicians. So they're finding their voice, and they're also being listened to in Brussels. That's a clear break with the past. It also breaks a little the story of the tired old Europe that never knows what it wants. Here are people who do know what they want to do and where they want to go. And I would not say we only find them in some Central and Eastern European countries. I say some because but you find them in Northern Europe, you find them in some Western European countries too. So I think the story of these blocks is also slowly disappearing. Central and Eastern, I've just started reading a book that argues that Central and Eastern Europe doesn't exist anymore. Because finally, many of the countries there are coming into their own. One of my main questions is, can the EU, can Europe be completely rights-based? I think it's the most rights-based major power in the world. But can it be totally rights-based? I am not sure. If we look at how we deal with what is happening in the Middle East, for instance, right now, it seems to be, there was an Israeli filmmaker on the French radio, France Culture, this week, in a morning program that is usually very deep, and the only thing they could discuss for 1 hour almost was why have these prominent French people not come out in favor of Israel, and what can be behind it? You know, our focus is so much on rights and on suffering. And don't get me wrong, but it also shows how helpless we are. You know, this doesn't get us any further. First, we all support Israel because their rights are violated, and now we slowly turn towards the Palestinians. Their rights are violated. But I would like us to focus more on how we get into a situation where fewer rights are violated. Full stop. We live in a world where we have a couple of big powers who don't intervene anymore, and we're used to big powers intervening or stifling things, but now we have nobody anymore. And this is, I think, why we've seen the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, why we're seeing the Gaza Strip exploding, and we will see. I mean, Bosnia is on the brink. I don't know what will happen there, and nobody is interfering. We're all looking on in horror. So the world has no arbiters anymore. We are becoming a jungle. And I would very much like to see if we are really idealists to work in a very pragmatic way, not as dreamers, but a very pragmatic way, which means being realistic as well. Working also with regimes perhaps that are not up to our standards, but can help us achieve our goals in international organizations, for instance, to make the world a better place. So this is the main question I have. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. You've already put your finger on a number of the issues of exactly where neo-idealism would need to develop and need to address if we are to truly move forward. I'm going to come straight to Alexander Windman on this, because we talked already a little bit earlier in the weekend about why a moral approach to geopolitics is actually the most practical approach to geopolitics. So getting to Caroline's point on realism.
Thanks. Thanks, Ben. Thank you for coordinating this, and Thomas. I think this is a critical conversation to have. Because there's pretty broad recognition to suggest that what we currently have in terms of foreign policy orientation, schools, has been inadequate, and that we're approaching a era where increasingly the rules seem to apply less, and we're returning to the rules of the jungle. I think with Thomas's introduction, it seems like achievements for neo-idealism may be few and far in between for the time being. So part of our task is to fix that. He recounted a couple hundred, punctuated briefly in moments, either in foundation or in between wars as crisis points, and then we return back to kind of realpolitik approach. So I'm glad that we're all here talking about this. Realism probably hasn't been particularly effective. I think that on balance, some realists arguing this point, but it hasn't been effective, in part because it hasn't really priced in the costs of short-termism, transactionality, maximizing gains in brief case might be, and then but slowly driving towards a kind of a crisis moment where the costs are exceptionally high. They're exceptionally high in human life, but they're also exceptionally high economically. So I think we're looking at something a little bit different, and we're looking at probably something closer to a balance, as Caroline pointed out, but where values are more sexually considered as part of our interests. So this is not an exclusive, scales don't tip entirely in one direction or another. That's impractical, but it's something that definitely recognizes that for democracies, values are central and at the forefront. And times where we stray because of crisis, we are cognizant of this, and we do that with the aim of getting back to our principal values. And there are probably some formulations, some heuristics that allows us to figure that loss of life, a security imperative, something of that nature, resources that we can apply, risks of action, inaction are all part of that equation. So I think that's the practice is something that we are have right in front of us that we're challenged with addressing. I think Israel is something that we probably need to spend a little bit of time talking about. I think what Caroline mentioned specifically with regards to the fact that we have this wild swing with a horrific attack from Hamas and a visceral reaction, and then a wild swing towards the plight of the Palestinians. And that is both shocking, unnerving, and I figure out why this is the condition. I think for many of the people in this room that have a security background, it's actually pretty clear. But for the population at large, it's probably a little bit more opaque why we should be so active and so supportive of Israel's right to self-defense, Israel's right to root out terrorism as an obligation from the state to its population, has to be responsible, and then at the same time urge them to abide by the law of war. So I think that's something that we might want to consider. I think there are some other practical areas. Another concrete one would be action around Ukraine. What do we want to do with regards to deliverables? I think part of the idea here is rallying support for Ukraine, both making the case that in part has been made in pockets, but we should crystallize both the value proposition and the interest proposition, and what we gain for not just our new kind of revival of neo-idealism, but what we gain for democracies in the globe. I think there were some concrete things we wanted to do. One of the things I've been struck by in this group is we have lots of former senior policymakers. We know that there are some gaps out there. I've mentioned one of them, logistics. That's not a big. First of all, it's not that expensive, but it's also not something that countries that are more ambiguous about how they contribute to Ukraine would be as spooked by. It's logistics to support what's already been provided. And then the last thing is actually in the context of Elvis's, Tomas's comments, what I was struck by is the fact that the same instincts about windfall and profit that affected, let's say, German, French calculus with regards to Russia are affecting our calculus with regards to, or have affected us for decades. And that gap probably needs to be addressed. And one of the things I think is interesting and worth considering, just completely off the cuff idea, but what about something practical about educating MBAs on geopolitics, where they more fulsomely incorporate the costs of geopolitics? And it's not just about the transaction, it's about the long-term costs, it's about the environment. But that's a good way to kind of train up our future neo-idealists. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Alex, thank you so much for speaking. This idea of how do we bring our various teams together on this is a big part of the question. How do we get businesses to properly price in geopolitical risk and pay the national security premium, if you like, to actually go forward and help us align the sources of our prosperity with our security? This is a key element of that, and it's not just politicians, it is people, it is businesses, it is civil society who all have to be on that team with our noses pointing in the same direction if we're going to actually win that. Chris Alexander, I want to turn to you next, because we have really identified the problem. We got a lot of stuff wrong in the past, but surely the last year, and this is drawing a little bit on what Brian said as well, last 2 years have shown actually we have started to make a turn in that direction. There are some people calling this right and pushing us in the right direction. So who are those neo-idealists? What have they achieved, and how can we broaden its appeal beyond actors?
Thanks, Ben. And I agree with you. That a new agenda that's driven partly by the thinking that's happened thanks to people around this table is taking shape. And thank you for bringing us together today. Thank you for the inspirational introduction to us to get us going. But it's only an agenda so far. And let's call it sporadic action, fragmentary action. And I think what we're talking about is something much more ambitious, which isn't yet being hasn't yet seized the political level. Still has actors, but which, with the right part, can go much further and actually be a driving force for a new era of progress towards the realization of the values and ideals that we all hold dear. And we shouldn't be afraid of this term new idealism. People will call us academics, people will call us idealists, but some people will have called us naive. But there really is no one in this city, in any of our democracies, in any of those societies now living under dictatorial rule, who doesn't value these things, who doesn't value these goals and purposes. This is not a new agenda. It's there in the UN Charter. It's there in the right to self-defense, which has existed for centuries and which Ukraine is now reinventing on a larger scale to serve today's purpose. It's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are ideals that, were there resources deployed? No. Ethical foreign policy. People in retrospect, although the idea of it at the time was. So it's about living up to this agenda that's always been with us. It's about linking our domestic action with international and foreign action, understanding that what we do at home determines what we're able to do abroad. If you don't have an informed citizenry, you will not be able to explain what is happening in Gaza correctly. If people, reporters, columnists, politicians cannot make the link between Hamas and Iran, if they say it's not proven, or just what the Israelis say, you will not have sound decisions made. Essential facts are still being distorted. And then it's also about making the vision we have for Europe. And those are some of the features. Another set of features are the voices, and we've mentioned Zelensky. I think it's important to mention that it is Ukraine, embodied by Zelensky, that really has given leadership in the last year. It's Alexandra Matvichuk. It's many you've inspired us over the last many years, but especially in the last year and a half. It is Kaja Kallas and other colleagues in the Baltic states. It is von der Leyen. It is a growing set of political leaders, not yet enough of them. More importantly, though, it's advocates in every country who are starting to speak up for this. They're usually wings of political parties or chairs of committees, not yet in the senior positions. We have to help empower them. And the most powerful tool we have, the most powerful voices we have, are the mass audiences, the large populations, the ordinary people that we know identify with these issues when they're properly trained. There is no European, I think, who hears from Ukrainians and hears from others who've seen the reality on the ground, who will not agree that Europe's future will be uncertain without a decisive result in Ukraine, which means Ukrainian victory, which means upholding the rule of law and upholding respect for borders. So what has neo-idealism achieved? It started to map the challenge. It started to point out who the adversaries are. I worked on Russia most of my career. Like Alex, it was agonizing to deal with colleagues through most of those years who denied that this agenda was being pursued by Putin, by his FSB, by his SVR, long before Georgia. They had a grand plan to get back at us for the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and especially to take back Ukraine, first by subversion and corruption, and then when that failed, by force. We need to expose the grandeur of their dark plans to start to be able to talk about, with the level of ambition we need to talk about a plan for succeeding, supporting victory in Ukraine, and then supporting another wave of democratic revitalization in many countries, which have to include Moldova, which has to include Belarus, which has to include Georgia, other countries of the Caucasus, Central Asia, and countries in the Maghreb and beyond. They will be inspired by our action if our action is principled and large enough in scale. Neo-idealism has also lit up the debate about information and disinformation. Moscow, in its most devious moments, has two priorities. One, sending meat to the meat grinder in Bakhmut, and two, sending money into American politics through dark channels to make sure their guy is back in the White House. And they do the same in Europe on a smaller scale, but through channels that we can all identify. That needs to be stopped. We need to live up to our values. They're universal. They've been neglected. They're inspiring and they are achievable. But we need to pursue this agenda. Tighter economic embargo of Russia, isolation of Russia, removal of Russia from the United Nations Security Council. I honestly believe there is no chance of us living up to our values if that country remains in that position in that council. We need to support victory for Ukraine. That means naval assets in the Black Sea, whatever the success in the short term of Ukraine without a navy against the Black Sea Fleet. It means air assets, it means logistics, it means much more than we've done so far. And then we need to think about this larger agenda that includes other dictatorships, Iran and its mischief across the Middle East and in our countries, Pakistan, which backed the Taliban for years and brought the disaster of 2021, which inspired partly to make his move in 2022. And of course, the big challenge of China. The most direct way to affect Chinese behavior now with regard to Taiwan and its neighborhood is by success and indeed supporting victory in Ukraine.
Thanks so much, Chris, for that. And there, I want to pick up on something that you said, because our question for this panel is also, who are the neo-idealists? And you made the point that in many places, in many countries, that there are people who have neo-idealist values who are not necessarily in the top leadership positions yet. And so I'd actually even like to use a German example for a moment. We have three very important committee chairs in Parliament of the Europe Committee of Foreign Affairs of Defense, of all three of the major governing parties who visited Ukraine far before Schultz did, and who used that position within Parliament to really put pressure on Schultz to act further. So this is something that I think is important to keep in mind, even though certainly leadership in the Baltics and in the Nordics and even in wider society, neo-idealist values might be a bit more apparent right away. I do think that we are also seeing evidence of this elsewhere. So thank you very much for making that point. I think that we come to the question of what we want, and I think points. I think it's quite evident that in more perhaps traditional Western democracies like ours, in Canada, for example, or indeed in Germany, that we've lost sight sometimes of what we want. What is the overall objective we want? And this is part of what's so challenging strategy, because we haven't defined an objective. Also, this comes to what our objective for Ukraine is. The Baltics are very clear about what their victory. We have not been able to say necessarily the same thing in other places. So I'd like to come to Artis Pabriks here quickly, and I'd like to ask a little bit about how you made the point. I love using this quote, I'm sorry, I'll use it again. We're willing to fight and die for freedom, are you? And I think that this is that sense of pride in liberal democracy that is evident in a quote like that. How do we encourage buy-in to that in more places? It's very clear in Central and Eastern Europe. It's very clear in Ukraine. How do we get it elsewhere, especially to my own countries, Germany and Canada, and other traditional democracies that maybe have lost their way a bit?
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for being invited here. I must say that the following things, what you will hear from me, not always will be satisfactory, and some might dislike it, but I have to use this opportunity to approach also the broader public, because I believe that if we want really to find right answers to those questions, what at the beginning of this session was stating, that we defined kind of what we need, how to reach this. And I will start with the announcement that I think it's important, first of all, to have an honest political debate, honest social debate, and not to avoid, first of all, calling a spade when it's needed, and also not to avoid to looking into the mirror to see ourselves. And sometimes if we see in the mirror, let's say, a post-party face, which is not maybe the most looking well, with all makeup, don't blame the mirror. It's not the mirror which is wrong. Now, and this is what I will try to do. So first of all, how to change and how do we act in our Western world to which all of us belong. And I think it was a bit, it gave me additional courage to speak about this after yesterday's discussion with another panelist here, Alice Stolmeyer from Direct Democracy. And this is about, let's say, our understanding how we act in politics. Because in our Western world, we always assume that the correct way is to be a rational politician. And if sometimes you are bringing something which is sounding like emotional, then it's per se assumed that this is a wrong thing, because of course, emotional people cannot be right in politics. So as soon as you start to get emotional when you speak about Ukraine, as soon as you start to get emotional when you speak about Ukraine, or when you speak about Israel or something else, oh, you know, that's not exactly what would bring us to the truth. I would say that we are actually committing here a mistake, because we are not robots, we are human people, and emotions determine reality. And if you don't believe me, then look, act yourself in, for instance, in social media, which is activities by algorithms, and algorithms are following first emotions and not a rational mind, and so making us also help of artificial intelligence, and these algorithms actually dependent on that. So that's just for the beginning to understand it. Now, from my side, of course, I would be, so that basically makes emotions very rational, and that determines the policy. Now, of course, you would ask me, and you were asking me, how to change this, and what shall we do? And being a long time in governmental positions and in executive positions, I was always challenged by the things. How can I achieve a result in a shortest period of time? Because the life of politician is always kind of very, very short, and you are frequently voted out. So you need to use a time span to achieve something. And I would just, for the sake of challenge of this discussion, I would suggest three things. Some of them, again, I warn you, you will not like. But I would like to choose them in three realms: a political one, a military one, and a societal or cultural one. And a societal or cultural one. And for the sake of this academic dispute here and challenge, in a political one, I would say, look, yes, Thomas was giving a splendid presentation how so-called Central and Eastern Europeans were right when determining what is wrong and how we should act. But if we honestly look into that European political nerve of our relations between so-called Western Europeans and so-called Eastern Europeans, and I told somebody yesterday, now once you speak about Poland or Baltics, you use the word Eastern Europeans. When you speak about Finland, none of you will use Eastern Europe, but some parts of Finland is more to the east than parts of Latvia. So obviously there is something else which determines your mind, which is not rational, actually. So that means that first of the thing would be probably to get away from this mental understanding that everything what Western Europeans defined in European Union, in NATO, and in global politics are actually superior to that of the Eastern Europeans. And that actually is one of also problems which makes, and I'm not standing here in defense, for instance, of Orban or Poland or somebody else, but which makes people resistant to those things what some Western politicians are saying, because we frequently feel that superiority which is coming along with the words you are mentioning. And this is the thing what we see also now, because we have no papers in European Union which have been not using the words of values. And then we come to the policy of Ukraine, and where are those values? Where is the defense of those values? Where are those values when Schroeder decided to work for Gazprom? I mean, isn't that right, what I'm telling? Now, Okay, I'll not go deeper, not to make us even more upset. It comes in another part. As far as the military, we see that, we made this very wrong policies of engagement. We are thinking we engage with authoritarian rules like Russia against our warnings, and they will become like us. They will become democratic. Forget about this. Your minds, not we change their minds. This is what happened. So stopped spending on defense, we stopped spending on military industry, we stopped spending on security in general. So now we can't provide neither ourselves nor Ukrainians with necessary goods because simply our military industries are depleted, they are weak. So we have to recognize that in many Western societies, like in former times, Fukuyama was writing, and I was writing my PhD, was telling us that now the liberal order actually won. No, it did not win. We lost because of this, because we lost the sense of this responsibility that actually we need also the hard power to defend our soft power. So we have to invest in this. And when I speak about Western societies, and which is less possible to see in our societies, in the Baltics or also even in Finland, the question of pacifism. When actually confronted with pacifists, I'm telling you one thing. For your right to be a pacifist, somebody else like us should risk our lives to stand for those values so you can walk on the that you don't like weapons, you don't want to touch them because you are not willing to defend those values. So we have to risk on your behalf so you have a claim that you are a pacifist. I think it's wrong thing. We should have to change this, bring this reality back about this type of values and defense of values. And really sickening discussion once we see how Ukrainians are dying to defend these rights, in fact, what they stand for European orientation. And we are having this discussion in number of Western media, among number of Western experts about defensive and offensive weapons. Is an axe offensive or defensive weapon? Or is a person offensive or defensive? If Ukrainian soldier is getting a simple pistol, but he is at the border with Russia and he's capable to shoot over the border, is this pistol offensive weapon or defensive weapon? So we were just brought away from the real reality, just making time pass, people die and doing nothing, just observing how people died in concentration camps, Holocaust, or today in Ukraine. This is what is happening. So where is our action? So this is what requires, if we claim to be a new idealist, to actually act rationally. So I mentioned parts of military, and the last one is societal and cultural, and you look at it. Now, look, it's a question of migration. And while we speak, in the last weeks, we had this discussion, which was also brought already some years ago by European Commission in Brussels about centralized distribution of migrant population, and not of refugees, but of migrant population. Because we know that at least 70% of those people which are crossing the Mediterranean are not refugees. We know that those people which are attacking now Latvian border with assistance of KGB and Belarusian authoritarian regime are not refugees, they're migrants which are brought and sponsored by the state. When my government 2 years ago was asking for assistance to commission, then one of the commissioners actually told, listen, we will not assist you to guard your border, but we can assist you to make another camp where you can take those people. No, I can't sell this to my public. And especially I cannot sell this to my public, seeing what is happening on the streets in London, Berlin, Paris, and in other countries now, once there have been this terrorist attack against Israel, and how many from these people are actually not integrated, standing against Israel, and in fact, in many ways, defending not an individual rights on which Western democracies are based, but defending their collective rights of their types of culture, which is in many ways totally in opposition to those principles on which Western political systems were built. And we have to tell this. And by not telling this, this is a reason why such parties as AfD is growing in Germany, having now 23% of population support, because people, they are afraid to speak about this in many societies, but they have this emotional and internal thing that something is wrong. We cannot support such type of approach. So it's not correct that if my female workers cannot walk even in the daylight in some cities like Brussels on the street without being harassed by people who are actually, sorry to say, of the immigrant origin. It's wrong if that revolution, what we reached in 1969 in the West, which includes also rights for gays and lesbians, are actually now totally abolished because of such type of an exchange of individual freedoms to collective freedoms of such type of value systems, which are actually failing. So you cannot discuss such policies of migrant centralized distributions by a European Commission, and nobody, I want to see that wunderkind politician who can sell this to societies in Poland or Baltic to such policies to be decided by somebody from us. It will simply not work. Look in the mirror and change these things. We will not be realists because we don't take into account how people feel and think about this.
Artis, thank you very much indeed.
Sorry for being very long.
Thank you. Someone on Twitter commenting ahead of our live stream panel today said, if you don't touch migration, this is a meaningless discussion. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. It's part of the discussion we need to have. But much like all the other issues we face today, we have to have an honest picture of it. And the story of migration and integration in Europe is a positive one as well. There are negative aspects, but we have to balance the positive out with that as well. And there haven't been enough politicians in recent years willing to actually make that case to our publics. We have delegated responsibility for the knowledge about migration to security agencies whose job it is to see the negative aspects of that. We haven't had a counterpoint to it. Just a couple of things to draw out before we hand to Thomas. This question of East and West. I mean, we're in Prague, west of Vienna. Prague, often referred to as Eastern Europe. Vienna, never referred to as Eastern Europe. I mean, this is famous. Mozart, leaving Vienna, talked about making his Oriental journey to Prague. This is a long-standing problem here. Secondly, where does change happen? I think, Artis, you are so right. So change happens in the hearts and minds of people. And this is why we need narratives, we need discourses, we need to actually go beyond throwing factoids at what are people's problems that are deeply related to sense of identity, sense of belonging, sense of being, and sense of a future. And that is absolutely essential if we are going to win this fight that all of us on this panel say we should win. I thought Caroline's point about this being potentially, if we get this right, a success story of European integration, actually. The overcoming of some of those age-old boundaries, hatreds, and distrust. There is a possibility to do that, but only if we seize this in the right way. And to take us in the right way, Thomas, I want to come to your opening remarks. You summarized the 1990s rather briefly with the quote about,
What about Roderick?
So we're coming, don't worry,
okay.
we're coming to Thomas's first, Roderick's going to wrap us up. Thank you.
Okay.
We're coming to Thomas's first, Roderick's going to wrap us up. Thank you. We have it under control. But that wasn't the only story of the 1990s. And we are here in the lands of the capital of hope of the 1990s too. This is the city of Václav Havel. This is the city of dangling keys. This is the city where all gates were open and the future seemed to stretch out before us. So how can we take inspiration from that? And is that in fact what some of the neo-idealists have been doing?
Well, it's not only the Czech Republic. I mean, it is in fact. I think what happened in the 1990s was that a broad swath of Europe actually turned out not only to believe in the ideals of liberal democracy and liberation, but they also enacted them. With varying degrees of success, I should also add that some were more so than others. Nonetheless, this was taken up by these countries, in which it did culminate ultimately in our accession to the European Union and to NATO. I mean, with maybe lower standards, than the European Union. And that was often against the expressed desire of the of old Europe. This, I mean, again, in our case, I mean, Helmut Kohl said the Baltic never joined the European Union. So we have those are positive experiences, which then, in terms of, if you ask about the Czech Republic, then we ended up with Klaus and Zeman. And this is I mean, this is the tragedy also of Hungary and the tragedy of Poland, a near miss in my own country. Today in Poland, we have the elections. Who knows? I think that, I mean, I don't want to ascribe blame, but I think a lot of the resentment that has fueled the populist revolt in the CEE is due to the kind of attitude that is expressed in the West. I mean, artists talk a long time about immigrants. On the other hand, my country has increased its refugee, well, its population by 6, now even 7%, taking in Ukrainians. Poland also has done, I mean, taken 1.1 million Ukrainians. It is not. I mean, that was the thing is that was all voluntary. What to in CEE was that it was imposed, and that's something that you know, given our histories, we don't like imposed policies like that. In any case, what I'm saying is that it was that what was the extreme promise of the early 90s for realpolitik reasons and for out of self-interest was besmirched and led to some of the results that we live with today.
All right, thanks very much. And to close us out, we have our research director at German Council on Foreign Relations, Roderick Parks. Roderick, I'd like to ask you a little bit about, first of all, let's talk about whether neo-idealism can be a broad church. And the reason I ask this is some of our main question: who are the neo-idealists? I mean, Sanna Marin in Finland, for example, is a social democrat. Kaja Kallas in affiliated with the Liberal Renew Europe at the European level, Ursula von der Leyen, a center-right Christian Democrat from Germany originally. And then we have the example of Green Foreign Minister in Germany, Annalena, who said the quote that we quite enjoyed, that the distinction between values and interests is, quote, total crap. Which was a great quote to be in the room for, obviously. So number one, is there room for neo-idealism to be a broad church that can actually encompass all of the different political traditions together? And secondly, I think we've also seen evidence that even in the people that I've named as examples as to who the neo-idealists are, obviously, we have the Baltics, we have a Finn, but we also even have some Germans that are starting to voice these kinds of principles. Is that perhaps a indicator of something that's been achieved in terms of broadening that appeal?
Give me a microphone. Bless you.
You're welcome.
Right. I mean, I love a moderator who throws a question at you just ahead of you on something slightly different. But I will respond as best I can. So I do actually
Slightly different.
You'll be cheerful to hear. I'll deal with some of that. I mean, 3 points. The main question for me was sort of who are the neo-idealists. And Ben and I work together, so we chat about this. Partly I share your analysis, partly I don't. Firstly, we have, I think, a shared sensibility of the Baltics from Central and Eastern Europe, having both worked, you here, me in Poland, at sort of formative times in our careers. For me, the most attractive bit often for neo-idealism is giving value and respect to what's happening here, and the sense in old Europe, as we haven't been calling it for 20, 30 years. The Western Europeans confuse rules for values and a international order that happens to suit them with a rules-based liberal international order. So I think neo-idealism for me gives value to not only a shift of focus from Western Europe to Central European countries, but secondly, from big member states in the EU to smaller countries. And you know that I share the sensibility of, think like a small state on international order in order to think big. And I think thirdly as well, getting away from the Western European sense of, you spread norms and values by leveraging your market power, having conditionality and having norm transfer, with a sense that, no, you have to have an attractive offer. Liberal democracy needs to be attractive, and you need to go and fight for certain things. There is a bit of a fly in the soup on this one, and it's a slight sense that you and I might be part of the problem. I note with some irony that it takes a Brit to give a, to give a label to this. And I was saying to Karen last night, I still get calls from German diplomats in Poland who say we would really like our German colleagues to be learning from Central Europeans, but we need a Brit in the room to kind of translate the messages because they just won't listen. And I know, having gone to Poland to work with Donald Tusk and Radek Sikorski, at a time when Poland was saying we want to go from being takers to policy makers, but we need someone like you to come and help us do that. And part of the reason it failed, I think, was because of people like me. So Central Europeans and Baltics, where do the Brits fit in? Not too sure. Second point, I think the Germans are neo-idealists. I entirely share your analysis that there isn't much neo-idealism in the German Chancellor at the moment. I suspect there's not a great deal in the Elysee, or if there is, just not in combination with Germany. But I mean, we're about to publish some polling data from German voters and consumers. And contrary to what the German government says, foreign affairs don't shift elections in Germany and Germans are complacent. No, I mean, we found German voters want government action on this. They are prepared to pay more for goods and services. They're prepared to reward companies that either de-risk or, indeed, in the case of Ukraine, take risks. But we also find that they don't understand the government position. And they don't think that if Germany stands up to, for example, China, that it will have an effect. And I think, very quickly what the government says about Germans being complacent or apathetic on international affairs then becomes self-fulfilling if the government doesn't kind of pull its socks up. So, secondly, I think Germans are neo-idealists, but government isn't. Thirdly, and I think possibly this is where I diverge from you, I would have, I think, more of a focus on neo-idealists outside Europe and outside the West. Not because I see a sort of coalition of neo-idealists in, terrible term, global South. It's more because of the sort of history. So in the conversation that we were having in Berlin, very focused on Ukraine, and the dates that we were looking back to was sort of 1939, 1945. If you look more globally, I think that the historical rhyme for me between today's world and yesterday's is 1955, 1956. Early Cold War, global bipolarity, Europeans working out where they stand between those two powers, but also how they deal with former colonies in Latin America, Africa, Asia. Back in 1955, I think if you'd asked who were the idealists, then it was precisely, Sukarno, the people who came together at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955, and tried to establish a liberal international order of sorts. And we in the West responded, I think, with our worst side, which was, to dismantle that. So if you can't find neo-idealists in what we used to call the third world, then I think it's because we didn't behave as idealists back then. And I think it's still worth looking for idealists in the former third world, so as to avoid repeating these mistakes.
Thank you very much indeed, Roderick. And yes, 55, 56, also the time of Suez, and another British moment of working out where exactly we stand and whom with. But perhaps it's also worth recalling the idealists who created the next phase of European integration at that time. That was a world beset with problems in which they still thought they could actually transform threats into opportunities by seizing that moment, thinking big and thinking beyond how we actually, how we transform, how we take the danger out of difference, how we actually interfere with each other's affairs in a constructive and positive way. So there are, I think, many lessons to draw from that time. Thomas, I'm going to give the last word to you, as you asked for it just a second ago, and then I will close out the panel and tell you what's happening for the rest of the day. So, Thomas, back to you.
Okay. Well, I mean, in a year, we will have the opportunity to see whether this makes any sense or not. And that is with the leadership of the European Union and of NATO. 25 years after the enlargement of NATO to the Visegrad countries, 20 years after the enlargement of the European Union to East Central and not only are we still called the new countries, but we have had one person from the region in any leading position, and the one that is probably the least consequential, and that is Donald Tusk for 5 years as president of the EU Council. Of the other three major positions, chairman of the Commission, or the president of the Commission, the High Representative for Common and Foreign Security Policy, and for the Secretary of General, no people from the region, which consists of roughly a quarter of the population of Eastern Europe.
Parliament president was a Pole. Anyway. I'm not debunking your point.
Half a term. I mean, that's
a prestigious position too.
It's a prestigious position, but it's not. I mean, prestige. I mean, look. I mean, King Charles has one of the most prestigious positions in the world, but it's not consequential. I mean, with all due respect.
The Brits are having a fine day here, aren't they?
I mean, we've already seen articles where Kaja Kallas has been dismissed as a potential candidate for NATO Sec Gen because she's too hardline. All right, who are we going to have? I mean, are we going to go this again with West Europeans running all of the major institutions, leading the major institutions? I mean, will Western Europe be able to stomach a high representative that doesn't go and kowtow to Moscow when he goes on a single visit to Moscow and blame the United States for something? I don't know. We'll see. So the test will come next autumn. And if we end up with the same old, then the concept of neo-idealism, we can say, has not really had much of an impact.
Challenge accepted. So when we reconvene next year, under the benign leadership of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, High Representative Gabrielis Landsbergis, and then Secretary General Kaja Kallas, we'll know we have succeeded a step further down the line. We look forward to bringing this about together. This session has raised exact questions I hope it was going to raise in order to prompt and fuel our discussions that are going to continue in the three off-the-record working groups that we're now going to split into after our coffee break. The first on defending liberal democracy, plenty to think about in the discussion here on that. Plenty more to consider on renewing liberal democracy, and that includes things about migration, it includes things about economics and how we arrange our societies domestically as well as internationally, and then on spreading liberal democracy and this question of indeed the inadequate term, but also of states that are caught in between, the other Zwischenländer. How do we actually relate to them, as well as how do we relate to autocratic regimes in dealing with global problems? For those of us joining online, thank you very much, and do come back to us at 17:15 Central European Summertime today, where we will be having a last online panel. But for now, thank you very much, and we break for coffee. Thank you all.